Okay, so this slide shows in a simple way how over time the capability of AI has increased compared to human performance. If you look at the top of the slide, there's a line, black line, that's human performance. You can see how handwriting got to that point some time ago, speech recognition got to that same time ago, image recognition even sooner. And then you see that the last two lines, the red and the purple lines at the end, this is reading comprehension and language understanding, have already surpassed human understanding. Now, the most interesting aspect of this slide is this is before ChatGPT was released, right? So we were already at the stage where language understanding and reading comprehension was at a level above humans. And that was before this last crazy 6 months of massive, product releases and innovation. This is really important, right? When AI can do language well and at a level greater than human, because so much of the way organizations operate uses language, it's pretty obvious that that's going to lead to a major change in the way organizations operate. And so this is sort of the backdrop for a lot of this explosion. Okay. So here's just some example capabilities of large language models that are relevant to businesses. I mean, people, presumably, as we know, a lot of people have used ChatGPT or or Bing Chat or Bard. But within a business context, there are other things other than chat, right? So, for example, we can use the fact that the AI models have some sort of understanding of documents to create explanations and summaries from documents. So we've got an example there, based on this report, so provide a report, based on this report, what will this organization's priorities be next year? So you're doing some market research, you want to understand what that particular company's doing, so you get it to summarize and explain that. Composition, writing documents on any topic. So you could have, say, write a project proposal from yesterday's discussion. You've got a recording of yesterday's discussion. It might have just been people speaking and that was automatically recorded and text generated. And then you could write a project proposal from that. You've got planning. You want to have, so the example is create a project timeline with work streams to deploy the new site. So you want to deploy a new website and you want to have a project timeline. You can look through the documents and create that. And then, of course, as I'm sure most of you know, interaction, you can conduct natural human-like conversations. So that can be used, for example, for customer support. Someone could say, I'm not sure what's wrong, but the leftmost light is blinking. And of course, that can then initiate some customer support. Now, that is the capabilities within, or a very small subset of capabilities within large language models. Of course, there's things like writing code, which is incredible. If you haven't done it, you should try it. There is logic now, in GPT-4 and other recent models, there is now much greater ability to do logic and problem solving. But then where things get really powerful and again, relevant to the use within organizations is autonomous agent technology. And these are often using large language models to do high level tasks. So this is just an example. This particular example comes from Baby AGI. And for those that don't know, AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence. And so this has a set of steps where a large language model can break down the objectives for a given task. So if there's a particular task you want to achieve, it's some high level task, the large language model will break that down into a set of, a high level objective, breaks it down into tasks. Those tasks can get prioritized by another language model. Those tasks can then get executed by a software that's calling APIs, and the software can even learn how to use particular APIs. It can run those code through those APIs, and then that can even generate new objectives that have new sets of subtasks and so on. So what you can have there is really powerful systems that can achieve high-level objectives pretty much autonomously. Now, this is really powerful, but of course, incredibly risky. And we've already seen with things like AutoGPT, it's possible to do things that are questionably have a lot of risks. So there's a lot of, this is all fairly early, but a lot of companies have jumped into this, and a lot of the some of the products coming out that are personal assistants and so on are using this type of technology. And just my final slide is just to say that here are some examples, and this is some examples of many of the way in which large language models are going to be used in organizations. It's not just that organizations, everybody in the organization will be using ChatGPT or similar. there will be products that are embedded into the way in which organisations run. So, for example, personal assistance is a big area. I mentioned Inflection.ai earlier. You know, they have a personal assistant that's now mature and being widely used. Things like automated email responding, customer support, of course, but not just customer service bots, you know, which are, you know, a chat bot to provide customer service, but a lot of organisations are working on internal customer support. So the customer support agent has some assistance, so they can look up questions that access the knowledge that the organisation has and allow them to better serve their customers, and so on and so on. And I won't go through those. Next slide. And over to Lockie.